Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. These days, there's an enormous debate about fixing and updating the United States' decrepit infrastructure. But understand that when we're talking about infrastructure, that means a heck of a lot more than just roads. It's bridges, waterways, railroads, docks and piers, airports, power plants, irrigation, pipes, power lines, communications, and more. But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to limit infrastructure mostly to what we think of as transportation systems, specifically railroads, because aside from steamships, railroads were a primary means of transportation during chattel slavery and helped to revolutionize the profits of the slavery industry. When it came to railroads and even steam engines, the slave South had the industrial North beat by a country mile, several hundred miles to be honest. Walter Johnson, in his book River of Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom, wrote that steam engines were more prevalent on the Mississippi River than in New England. Slave labor for cotton and other commodities made steamships a profitable business. Slave owners would often rent out black people to be labor on the steamboats. But the railroads were even worse. Now you have a form of transportation that was far faster than a steamboat and wasn't bound by the waterways. It could go directly to its destination. Southern slave owners were the main stockholders and directors of many railroad companies. The South became a place where railroad building boomed, building some of the earliest and longest rail lines in the U.S. In the beginning, the railroads rented slaves, but before long, the railroads began buying slaves themselves outright. Wachovia gave a feeble apology for one of the banks that had acquired Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, which owned at least 162 black people as slaves. The railroads were built with black labor and paid for with slave bonds. One estimate places over 10,000 black people being forced to build the railroads every year. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of misery. Build more railroads, move more cotton. The railroads become more valuable, which incentivizes the building of even more railroads, and so on. Since so much of the ties between slavery and the economy were in Louisiana, we're going to use them as a case study. Louisiana State University's website features a thesis paper written by social scientist and historical scholar Merle Elwin Reed in 1957. The great thing about Reed's research is that he uses practically all primary sources. That means that he had to get the original records from the railroad companies themselves and from the state legislature. We'll start with the New Orleans and Nashville Railroad. We already know the railroads began using slave labor practically from the moment they laid down the first lines in the 1830s. Now, the guys who planned the railroads in the South were usually plantation owners or merchants adjacent to the plantations who were trying to figure out more efficient ways to move the slave-derived cargo. But there's no railways or anything else unless somebody pays for it. And who paid for the railroads? The government. Federal, state, and local. In the early 19th century, there was an iron tariff in place by the U.S. Congress to help protect the Pennsylvania steel industry from foreign steel manufacturing competition. But in order to encourage industrialization, in 1832 the U.S. Congress granted a special tariff waiver to iron used for railroad lines. This was a big help to the railroads like the ones in New Orleans, because without that waiver, a railroad in New Orleans would have had to pay $197 a ton for steel from Pittsburgh, as opposed to the $50 a ton that they could get it for from the English. That's an almost 75% savings. So right from the jump, the U.S. Congress altered tax policy to benefit one industry in specific. Can you think of any time that Congress did that for black people? I'll wait. This is what Jason Black means when he says a key practice of white supremacy is picking and choosing winners. They want to decide who the winners will be. They don't leave it up to chance. With the Congressional Act, the railroad industry was insulated from having to pay the same price for iron as every other business in the country. But that wasn't all. Normally, whenever someone wants to start a corporation, they have to get stockholders together. Well, the good old boys down in Bayou Land were never savvy businessmen, so naturally they had trouble finding gullible fools with more money than sense. So they went to the New Orleans City Council, who the railroad had conveniently reserved 5,000 shares for, just in case the city wants to get in on the action. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. The New Orleans and Nashville Railroad asked the city council to buy their stock and issue bonds based on it. The New Orleans City Council agreed, ponying up bonds to the tune of $500,000. Now keep in mind, that was in the early 1830s, so adjusted for inflation, it would be a hell of a lot more today. But even a big infusion of cash like that wasn't enough. These would-be railroad magnates wanted to go to New York or even to Europe to seek investors, but they already knew that neither Wall Street nor the English banks would invest in shady ventures from clearly incompetent businessmen unless, as Merle Elwin Reed put it, some responsible agency other than the chartered railroad company agreed to underwrite the loans. And since no private company was willing to invest in their railroad, they went to Louisiana's state legislature, who eagerly gave them the money. The Louisiana legislature decided to underwrite these railroads and began issuing bonds based on the credit of the state. So the legislature put the taxpayer on the hook if these guys failed to pay their investors. Of course, if you're going to build a railway, you'll need someone to survey the area that the railroad route will run through and to determine materials and costs. Fortunately, the state legislature paid for that too. As Merle Reed put it, free surveys were a boon to the railroads because qualified engineers were scarce and their services costly. But even that was just the beginning of the help that the railroads got from the state. The legislature authorized loans to be given to the railroads. The state and local governments also granted the rail lines monopolies on routes. But in addition to bonds, loans, and monopolies, the state also gave the railroads long-term tax exemptions, rights of way through state land, and the power of eminent domain over private property. Even the federal government got in on the act, with the U.S. engineers performing a survey for the West Feliciana Railroad and granting other public land and rights of way. Merle Reed documents that in 1833, the Louisiana legislature created a board of public works who owned their own gangs, plural, gangs of Negro laborers owned by the state. As Reed writes in the footnotes, in 1833, the purchase of 150 Negro laborers was authorized for use in public works projects. When these laborers were not employed by the state, they were hired to internal improvement companies. Keep in mind, this thesis was written in 1957, but even then, they were very careful to try to minimize the use of the word slave as much as they could, instead saying laborers. Well, a laborer implies that there was some sort of bargain between the person working and the person who hires them. It implies that the person working has a choice. When you buy someone, that's not a laborer, that's a slave. And when Reed writes that they were hired to internal improvement companies, well, the slaves weren't hired, they were lent out. And internal improvement companies means private interests, like the railroads, which the Louisiana Board of Public Works also invested in on behalf of the state. And as if all that wasn't enough, as if the state giving loans to the railroads and buying bonds to help them out, and the state also giving them tax exemptions and all the rest of it wasn't enough, there were some railroads in Louisiana, such as the New Orleans and Carrollton Company, who were authorized by the state to conduct banking activities for themselves. So all the money that the state of Louisiana gave them wasn't enough. Instead, on top of that, let these guys quadruple and quintuple dip and let these guys just become banks. And what, pray tell, did the railroads do with all this money they were getting? In 1835, the corporate directors of the New Orleans and Nashville Railroad purchased a number of slaves in anticipation of labor shortages the following year. Merle Reed writes that the Pontchartrain Railroad Company frequently hired slave labor and began buying slaves in 1833. They started off with 11, and 2 years later they increased that to 22. This is how the railroads began, and keep in mind, Louisiana wasn't the only one. They actually used what they saw in other states as a model for what they did. What was going on in Louisiana was going on all over the South. You look at other railroads such as the Western and Pacific Railroad in Georgia, these guys were the ones who basically had a large part to do with the establishment of the city of Atlanta. Reason for that was the place that we call Atlanta today was actually the end of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. By the way, on a side note, the Western and Atlantic Railroad was owned by the state of Georgia. This is so-called capitalism in the United States. This is the so-called invisible hand of the free market. Does this look very invisible to you? These railroads were not being set up for the use of the general public. They were being set up so private businessmen could create an industry for themselves and pocket the money for themselves. And the state used the taxpayers' coffers to hand these guys money and anything else they wanted. Who needs stockholders when you're being funded by the state? William Thomas writes that the South pursued railroad expansion as fast as the North, laying as many miles of track in the 1850s as the Midwest, and even exceeding the pace of construction in much of the North. William Thomas also writes that by the 1850s, the railroad companies could be counted among the largest slaveholders in their regions. He cites the South Carolina Railroad's 1857 annual report, which documented that the company owned 57 black people as slaves, and that in 1859 it almost doubled that number to 90. Meanwhile, the Virginia Central Railroad owned 35 black men. And how much benefit did the railroads get from all the slaves they owned? In his book, Rethinking the Civil War Era, Paul S. Scott writes that by 1860, the South's railroad network was one of the most extensive in the world, and nearly all of it had been constructed by less expensive slave labor. I want you to think about that. Because whenever people try to envision the great railroad systems, the Deep South doesn't come to mind, but that's mainly because part of how white supremacy works is you drop things down the memory hole. William Thomas added that the railroad's demand for black slave labor was so high that they caused the price of slaves to go up throughout the entire region. Now imagine that. The railroads caused a slave shortage because that's how many black people that they were forcing to work for them. But then there was the question of how much revenue did the state get for their railroads? Raw cotton made up more than half the nation's exports in the first 6 decades of the 19th century. That's between 1800 and 1860. And all of it was grown by slaves. Industry in the North expanded rapidly, especially after the 1830s. Yeah, after those southern states got serious about putting their revenue behind these railroads. The industrial North expanded rapidly after the 1830s, indeed. And now you know the reason why. So it was black labor that laid the rail lines and who laid the vast majority of them. That's important because when someone tries to tell you that the Irish or the Chinese built the railroads, that's simply not true. The Irish didn't come in any appreciable numbers until the mid-19th century, and even then they weren't a majority of railroad workers. As for the Chinese, their laborers were limited mostly to the Transcontinental Railroad, and they didn't show up to work on that until the 1860s. That's nearly 2 generations after black people had already built the crisscrossing network of rail lines across the South and in the East. The Transcontinental Railroad began in Sacramento, way out west. Even the History Channel's own website had to cop to that one. The Chinese laborers were almost entirely in the West. Black labor, on the other hand, was what built the rest of the country's rail lines. There's this effort on to rewrite the history books and to erase black people from it and to claim that everyone was equally involved in the building of the country and everyone was more or less here at the same time and everyone more or less made the same contribution, and that's simply not true. If some guy from an Irish shanty comes to the U.S. and gets denied a job because a business owner doesn't like Catholics, that is not the same as a black person who was born into slavery, defined as less than human by the law, and whose children are condemned to the same fate before they're even born. If some Chinese laborer immigrates here to build one rail line during a 5-year period, that does not equate the black laborers who built the rail lines from the early 1800s almost up to the 1960s. As I covered in part 1 of this series, just looking at Wall Street, it was black people who literally built Wall Street. They built the wall and the roads around it that Wall Street was named after. Had it not been for black people who built the roads, who built the streets, who built the nation's capital, who were the ones who actually built the railroads, there would have been no country for the Irish or the Chinese or anybody else to immigrate to. And they all wanted to get in here because of the opportunities that existed, but who made those opportunities possible? Black people's relentless, uncompensated labor was what made all of that wealth possible. It couldn't have been the Irish or the Chinese or the Germans or any of the rest of them because they weren't here, certainly not in any appreciable numbers. As with the rest of the culture, the black influence on the railroads extends to a lot more than just our physical presence. You've probably heard the term Gandhi dancer, but you probably don't know what it means. Gandhi dancers was what black men who worked on the railroads were called, specifically the black men who performed maintenance on the rail lines. Trains are enormously heavy, and their weight is shifting all the time. This causes the railroad lines to become deformed over time. So what happened was the railroads needed black men to go out there and literally pull the rail lines back into shape. The term Gandhi most likely comes from the Gandhi Manufacturing Company of Chicago. That was the company who supplied hand tools for the railroad workers. And as for the dancer part, that was because the black railroad workers had to move in unison in order to push those steel rail lines back into shape. Oftentimes, they would work to a song. One member of the road crew would act as the lead, usually singing some song that would establish the rhythm of the work. And they weren't doing it just for entertainment purposes either. In order to maximize the amount of force the black men could exert on the steel, they had to push or pull with pinpoint precision. The lead man singing established the exact rhythm that would allow them to do this back-breaking work for hours a day. So not only did black men build America's railroads, they also maintained them too. And it stands testament to how strong these men were that even when they were elderly, they were still able to demonstrate how they pulled the rail lines back into shape. At a point when most men their age are either in a rocking chair or a wheelchair, these men are demonstrating work that they did decades ago, showing that even the rail lines weren't strong enough to break a black man's back. Pretty much the only jobs that black men were prohibited at that time to have any part in was being a conductor on the train, but other than that, black men did practically everything else. Black people were also forced to build a number of the piers, docks, and ports of the United States, and it should be noted that a number of those rail lines and ports and docks are still in use to this very day. And just as with the banks, a number of those railroads wound up either being gobbled up or merged with some other rail lines or some other business, a few of whom are still around in some form or another to the very present. There were a lot of entities at all levels who were making a killing every single day off of the enslavement of our people and the free labor that we were forced to produce. So while they were riding the railroad, we were the ones being railroaded. That's the reason why we are not dropping the issue of the reparations that we are owed. It's time that all of these profiteers from slavery were put on notice that their gravy train just derailed. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Mandisa, Christopher Ellis, Isaac, Sean Gilchrist, and Wade Blanks. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.